My name is Robert Davis. I spent much of my life traveling around the United States, creating landscape works with my friend and travel partner Franklin Brown. Much of our traveling occurred when we were young men looking to make a name for ourselves in the late 1840s. Inspired by artists who thought to explore the land our great nation was being built upon, we decided to immerse ourselves in the natural beauties of the Americas in order to discover and create works similar to those that inspired us. Frank and I were both tradesmen, hoping to move on to more creative pursuits. Frank started his craft as a humble potter, gathering clay from the earth himself and creating magnificent works of yellowware and redware pottery. His craft was one passed down for many generations of his family. I, however, started my journey of artistic endeavors as the apprentice of a printer. Eventually, as life would have it, we both decided to change paths after seeing the works of Thomas Cole ourselves in a local shop in downtown New York City, while we were both still young men trying to pave our way into the world. I remember that painting from time to time when making my own works in the wilderness of New York. It was a simple piece of Niagara Falls in the cool autumn of 1830. The airy and loose brushstrokes perfectly captured the loose, wild, and untamed beauty of the natural landscape of America. This painting was the single turning point in our careers that drove us towards our decision as artists to explore the territories and states that lie beyond New England and the eastern seaboard. Seeing artists like Cole expand their work with depictions of man and nature working harmoniously, using depictions of everyday American life as a means to show the contrast between Mother Nature's strength and the ever wrathful presence, and man defenseless and ultimately weak to her. Even if we spent years roaming around the frontier, we'd never amount to the artistic skill Thomas Cole had gained all on his own. But hoping to gain even an ounce of his talent and experience, we decided to gather our funds and materials and head off to the state of Indiana and beyond, in hopes of finding scenes that inspired us as much as the very same painting that gave us the push we needed to begin our journey. We spent several months slowly making our way to the frontier, traveling by foot and down waterways, hoping to stumble upon a hidden gem of earth along the way. Our journey began in Albany, New York. The Erie Canal was busy, and there were many travelers hoping to catch a ride to a destination unbeknownst to us. We spent much of our time in the city, roaming around, looking at the sights, sketching buildings and people, as well as buying supplies for our journey, which would surely be long and arduous, as we intended to go the full length of the canal through Lake Erie to the Miami, Wabash, and Erie Canal, and hopefully reaching Ohio and Indiana in no more than 2 weeks. We'd been told by a friend and fellow artist that their journey had taken no more than 5 days to reach Buffalo and change boats to head out onto the lake. We hoped our journey would be the same. We boarded a packet boat in Albany and arrived in Buffalo, making small stops along the way. We watched as many passengers who had boarded with us left slowly. We were one of a small handful of individuals who had stayed for the entire journey. The boat only moved about 4 miles per hour, which, despite the slow pace, allowed for Frank and I to pass the time on deck, drawing our fellow passengers as they lounged about. After roughly 5 days, we reached Buffalo, with about $14 left of the original 30 we'd each brought. We both began to worry that we'd severely underestimated how much money the trip would cost us. When we arrived in Buffalo, New York, we barely had enough money to get us to Toledo, Ohio through Lake Erie. Toledo was a small port town in Ohio, having recently been added to Ohio after the Ohio-Michigan border dispute over the Toledo Strip only 10 years prior to our arrival. The town seemed to be growing ever slowly with the canal connection to New York. We didn't stay long in Toledo, mostly because we wanted to reach the Ohio River Valley area and paint scenic views of the mountainy parts of Indiana and Ohio, as well as some of the bustling industrial life that Toledo lacked with its tiny population of around 1,200 people. When we arrived in Toledo, all we had was about $3 and most of our art supplies. Looking back on it now, we were likely charged more than we were supposed to somewhere along the Erie Canal. because most other passengers only paid about half that amount for the entire journey. In order to make up for what was lost, we ended up staying in Toledo for a few nights doing small odd jobs to make money while staying in the town's local inn. I painted a new sign and a portrait of the building for the inn we were staying at. The process was slow, but it paid well. I managed to make about 50 cents when the process was done. Frank painted portraits for a wealthy family and made a whole dollar doing a set of 5 portraits. In order to get the portraits done in a timely manner, Frank kept to a simpler art style that differed greatly from the typical style of European portraiture. The portraits were simple busts of each member of the family, all facing towards the viewer in a simple, neutral expression. Many paintings made by traveling American artists were made in this fashion, mostly because they were making art to suit the taste of the people who paid for them as opposed to academic works, much like the works we'd aspired to make. Frank did all of his paintings on pieces of wood that were provided by the family. Similarly, the sign I painted was also done on wood rather than canvas. I painted the name of the inn, as well as a few patriotic symbols, as the client suggested to add more focal interest to the sign. After our work was done, we decided our next stop would be Cincinnati, Ohio. In order to get there quickly and efficiently, we again opted for Ohio's canal system. We took the Miami and Erie Canal to Cincinnati. We stopped in Cincinnati to see Frederick, a close friend of ours who had moved out west to do the same work we had. Frederick gave up his dream of being an artist like Thomas Cole in favor of raising his family in Cincinnati as a carpenter. Frederick spent his days creating beautiful works of furniture for locals. He made wooden dowry chests, clocks, desks, and a variety of other types of furniture, occasionally even painting them with scenic views of the Cincinnati area or the Ohio River. Frederick was able to mix his trade background with his work as an artist to create unique furniture that couldn't be found elsewhere. We stayed with Frederick and his family for a few days and thankfully preserved our last few dollars to journey further west. After bidding Frederick and his family goodbye, we continued our journey into Indiana. We traveled from the Ohio River into the Whitewater Canal. The trip was easy going and not quite as crowded as our trip from Albany to Buffalo had been in New York. We spent a lot of time walking beside the horse, pulling the packet boat up the canal, and sitting on the roof drawing the scenery with what measly bit of supplies we each had left. We planned to head up north again to Cambridge City and follow the old National Road out of Indiana and into the state of Illinois. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, we each ran out of money around the Brookville area in Indiana. After we ran out of money in Brookville, we spent much of our time making folk art for the people of the city. We painted anywhere they wanted us to for however much money they'd give us. We made portraits, painted signs, and staged coaches. We created drawings and paintings of local buildings and towns, all so we could gain a bit of cash to continue our journey out west. We apparently weren't the only artists who'd run out of money during our journey to the Mississippi River. The local townsfolk informed us that just a few weeks earlier an artist had stopped through here and painted the inside of several houses in hopes of receiving a bit of money and a place to stay for the night. I painted several overmantels and fireboards, which was, according to Frederick, a popular request in the southern parts of Indiana and much of the Ohio River Valley area. I was asked to paint local scenes of Brookville, even down to specific buildings on a piece of canvas set into wood. Once Frank once again worked on countless portraits, a few for mourning families, a few for individuals who simply wanted a portrait of themselves or a loved one. Another popular request was to make paintings of the town and the Whitewater River itself. We together even painted a few small murals in the houses of the townspeople. After a few days of making art for Brookville, we were invited to stay at the home of the Goodwins, a prominent family of Brookville. The Goodwins wanted us to paint portraits of their family. While we painted, we were told the story of their family history as well as stories about local Indiana history that neither Frank and I had heard much of in our travelers. or travels. We were told that they descended from a man named Samuel Goodwin, who had apparently come to Brookville around 30 years before our arrival and taught the town about Methodist traditions and Christianity. We painted the portraits of the Goodwin family in a much more academic style. While Frank and I hadn't gone to art school in New York, we spent much of our lives exposed to paintings that reflected the styles and aesthetics of Europe. The Goodwins seemed to be one of the few families that we'd done portraits for that seemed to have an interest in the kinds of works we'd been used to making. Many of the paintings we'd made for the regular townspeople of Brookville were created in styles that were familiar to them. These artworks that had been made for them by artists seeking to travel like Frank and I reflected simple, less academic art styles. Many of these artists created more conceptual works rather than perceptual works. In a portrait painting, these artists often painted features that would be hidden in perspective, which in more realistic academic conventions would follow visual or perceptual perspective. Traveling through Indiana and Ohio allowed Frank and I to be exposed to the works of folk artists who seemed to stay away from the kind of gallery-driven works that we aspired to be a part of. The paintings created by these artists also tended to appear to be flat, not only due to the lack of proper shading, but also due to the lack of knowing how to properly foreshorten works. While becoming more familiar with these kinds of painting styles, Frank and I worked on our own paintings of local peoples going about their days. We painted people strolling through Brookville's market house. We did our best to reflect the atmosphere of the people walking through and buying their goods and produce while showing the farmers selling the goods. This journey was our first of many, as we spent years traveling around the country, but no trip we ever took was ever as memorable as our first journey out west to Brookville, Indiana in the late 1840s. We both looked fondly upon our being stuck in Brookville for several weeks as a happy accident, as we were able to make many more permanent works of art while enjoying the experience of staying in a smaller, more relaxing town.